Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome in to another new episode of The Lager Line, as always served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbox Brewing. I'm Ben DuBose, your host, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire, and contributor to Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. I'm joined, as always, by my good friend, co-host, and producer out of Portugal, Paulo Alves, who you can follow on Twitter/X at Paulo Alves NBA. Me, I'm at Ben DuBose. So as we chat this first week of May, we're just over a week away from the 2024 draft lottery on Sunday, May 12th. The Rockets are guaranteed to have at least one lottery pick, and it's the one from Brooklyn, which will most likely be at number 9 overall. However, there is about a 20% chance that it could jump into the top 4, and I believe about a 25% chance that it could fall back to 10 or 11. So there is still a little bit of intrigue there as it pertains to the final positioning of that pick. The Rockets also have a small chance, about 7%, of keeping their own pick in addition to the Brooklyn pick. The Rockets traded their own 2024 first-rounder to OKC as part of that awful Chris Paul, Russell Westbrook trade from 5 years ago, but it is top 4 protected, and Houston enters the lottery with the 12th worst record in the league. That gives them a 7% chance of jumping into the top 4. So we will have clarity on that very shortly, again, just a little over a week away on Sunday the 12th. And as for the podcast, we'll do more draft talk once it becomes clear where the Rockets are picking and thus the types of prospects that we should be focused on. One small silver lining for me is that, honestly, no matter what the lottery results are, the Rockets are getting a pick from Brooklyn that is guaranteed to be better than any they would give up to the Thunder. That's because the only way the Houston pick would jump the Brooklyn pick in the order is if Houston gets one of those 4 lottery picks, and that's the incredible scenario where you then have 2 lottery picks. So the bottom line is, even if you do lose your own pick to OKC, you've got a better one coming in from Brooklyn 100%. So as far as today's show, we're going to focus on the NBA playoffs, which are in progress as we speak. I think there are quite a few storylines relevant to the Rockets, but I want to start with a financial one for a couple of reasons. First off, we've got some hard data. And secondly, I think it's very, very encouraging data when you extrapolate its implications to the Rockets. So top 10 payrolls in the NBA for this season: Warriors, Clippers, Suns, Bucks, Celtics, Nuggets, Heat, Lakers, Pelicans, Cavaliers. Let's go through those 10 teams real quickly. The Warriors lost in the 9-10 play-in game, didn't even make it to the playoffs. The Suns and the Pelicans got swept. The Lakers and Heat were gentlemen's sweeps. The Clippers and Bucks, as we're recording this Thursday night, May 2nd, are one game from elimination, and it's possible by the time we upload this that maybe the Bucks already are eliminated. The Cavs are up 3-2, but they still haven't advanced out of the first round, and honestly, short of getting to the conference finals or beyond, they're probably in a precarious spot this summer no matter what, because it's a small market and Donovan Mitchell will be 1 year from his contract expiring. Now, the Celtics and Nuggets are in great shape, but we knew that already. They're the gold standard of the entire NBA. The point is, 8 of the top 10 teams in the league by payroll are in potentially precarious spots this summer, and 5 of them are in the 10 teams that finish in front of you in the Western Conference standings. And from there, there's just so many potential benefits. The theme that ties it all together, as I see it, is that high payrolls means high expectations. Because to start with, owners usually aren't very happy to repeatedly pay top dollar payrolls for teams that aren't even good enough to get to the conference semifinals. And that could be the case even more this summer, now that the NBA's new collective bargaining agreement has some harsher financial penalties, as well as some restrictions for GMs that can make team building much more difficult for teams that want to go into the luxury tax. I'm going to read you a quote from Pat Riley, who's led basketball operations in Miami for quite some time, said just prior to this season starting: if you build a team around 1 or 2 players, 3 players, and you don't win the championship, then you might have to start thinking, okay, this is not going to work. this is not going to happen. That's always, to some extent, been the story in the super team era. Obviously, we saw it the last few years with the Brooklyn Nets and with the Rockets owning their future draft capital. That's been to Houston's benefit. But I think that's even more so the case now that we're in this era where the new CBA puts even harsher financial and team building penalties on these high-priced veteran teams. Now, I will acknowledge that some of those teams that I referenced earlier, like the Suns and the Pelicans, have had owners or GMs who have come out this week and said that they plan on either staying the course, i.e. the Suns, or aggressively looking to upgrade the roster around Zion Williamson in the case of the Pelicans. Here's the thing. Teams always say that at the start of an offseason. Nobody ever comes out in May and says, fire sale, we're tearing it all down, we're looking to cut costs. Because that just puts you in an awful leverage spot. For an example that I think everybody can remember, think back to the Rockets in 2019 and 2020. In 2019, in May and June, we heard for 2 straight months that, the Rockets could run it back with James Harden and Chris Paul. And then what happens the first week of July? They trade Chris Paul and 4 years worth of nearly unprotected draft assets. Thankfully, Daryl Morey was able to get the top 4 protection, which kicked in 2021. Who knows, maybe it kicks in again this year. But the point is they did a terrible deal at the behest of James Harden because it was the only way they could keep Harden from asking out at that time. And then in 2020, once Mike D'Antoni and Daryl Morey left, and there were reports that James Harden and Russell Westbrook wanted out, initially the Rockets did the whole song and dance. We don't have to do anything. What happened? Russell Westbrook was dealt before the offseason was over, and James Harden was dealt not even 10 games into the ensuing regular season. So everybody always says, we don't have to do anything. We're not under pressure. We can just stay the course. But that's not always how it actually plays out behind the scenes. And it could be because an owner or a GM has a certain directive that they don't want to say publicly at this point. Or it could also be, and this is the other part of the equation, the players involved. Because even if the owner is willing to pay the high tax bill and the GM is theoretically willing to put up with the team building restrictions, those high priced teams are generally high priced because they've got high profile veteran players, and those guys usually have a lot of influence and they're not patient to be on mediocre teams. So even if ownership and management are willing to put up with the high cost and you take their word at face value about running it back, it's entirely possible that their hand still gets forced at a later date because the star player decides to use his leverage. The bottom line, as I see it, the fact that most of these super expensive teams are struggling, it's great for the Rockets. Maybe there ends up being a trade target that Houston could potentially acquire from one of those teams. We'll get to that in a little bit. But even if there's not, the reality is that 5 teams ahead of you in the West standings suddenly have very uncertain outlooks with super high payrolls. At a bare minimum, that can make it a lot easier to climb the standings. And that's before we even get into the Rockets being younger than most of those teams and thus having players that should improve rather than regress over the upcoming offseason. My last point, and then I'll turn it over to you, Paulo. One of the most common themes I've heard when I've talked to people around the league this year is how unsustainable the current balance of power feels. The general sentiment is that way too many teams are aggressively trying to contend at the same time, and some of them were destined to be very upset when they end up with expensive teams that crash and burn early in the playoffs. Combine that with the draft classes of 2025 and 2026 being fairly loaded, which will reward bad teams, and it just feels like something has to give. Somebody will take a step back. The pendulum is due to swing the other way. I think that's basically the point we're at now, and whether the benefit is direct or indirect for the Rockets, it feels like by and large, it's a very positive trend for a franchise like Houston that is on the way up and doesn't yet have a super high payroll. Paulo, what's your perspective as to the payroll angle and these expensive teams that are going out sad?
Yeah, I was actually surprised this year that more teams didn't, cut bait on their, contending or attempt to trajectory to tank, as we saw many teams do throughout the last couple of years when the Rockets were tanking. I thought there were many teams in prime position to do so. I thought the Clippers were a potential one, but then their season picked back up, so it was fine. I thought the Bulls were definitely a candidate. I was surprised that they didn't just sell at the deadline. There's just clearly no hope there. I don't get why they keep trying to do this.
I think this is where the weakness of the 2024 draft could be a one-off. in that because this draft in the lottery portion in particular isn't as strong with difference makers as it usually is, that might be why more teams didn't sell off this year, but likely would in 2025 and 2026 when there are more franchise-changing players in those top 10 picks or so.
Yeah, for sure. I think that makes sense. But then at the same time, it's not like they're gaining anything from other than, the monetary value of just staying a little bit more relevant and having more fans in the seats. I don't really see how. I mean, you could probably save some of that money just by, shedding salary even throughout the season. You always have an advantage picking higher, even if there isn't a perceived tier drop off or if there aren't as defined as they were in last year's draft, for example, or the year before with the big three, or the year before that with the one, and then Jalen and Mo, whatever it was. That being said, I actually think as far as that impacts the Rockets, we've made this point in previous spots, and I think it will be a common theme, going forward in this spot as well. We're at a stage where we have so much young talent and so many guys that need minutes that I think the way you improve this roster, if not for a structural trade, which I think is not, if it's a structural trade for a star, that's not necessarily a team trying to shed salary. I kind of interpret, the question you were posing as, teams that have really expensive teams, but are not necessarily looking to blow it up, but rather trying to, change the outlook of the team around the core of stars. And
I think it could be a combination of the two, though. I'll get to a suggestion in a few minutes, but it could be a situation where you sell off one big piece for a few medium-sized pieces that could still sort of give you a chance in the interim, but with a different mix, a little bit more depth, and then you save some money by offloading one of the really, really expensive contracts.
In that case, in some very specific, players that are, at least 28 or younger, then I would see the merits of us making a trade, or I would see the merits of how that would impact the Rockets. But I think most teams that are not just completely blowing up would be looking to move off of guys that are highly paid, but not necessarily a part of the core. Names that pop to mind. I mean, with the Suns, there's it's not Garrison Mathis. It's the other white dude that everybody hates. That's a shooter.
Grayson Allen.
Allen, exactly. He just got extended, so he's obviously not going to get traded this offseason. But that's the type of profile player that I was expecting to, that I'm expecting these teams to kind of shed. I think the Warriors, as much as they are, light years ahead and not worried about the money and everything, I have to expect that Andrew Wiggins has to be a trade candidate, and he'd be interesting.
They re-signed Klay Thompson.
Yeah, and he'd be an interesting piece for the Rockets. But we already have Dylan Brooks. And it'd be arguable between the both of them which one of them is the better player. But, Andrew Wiggins is making $10 million more a year for just as many years. So it wouldn't make much sense to even make that trade for the upgrade that it is, even if it is an upgrade at all. So I think for us, it's going to be tough because with the core six plus Dylan, plus Steven Adams, and plus Fred VanVleet, the rotation is not necessarily set, but it's close to it. And so you're either looking for, third string type guys, or guys that that can work as human trade exceptions, that we could trade some of the guys that are expiring on our team in order to keep that salary alive if that's what we want. An example of that would be Keshante, obviously.
But my point was also not just from the perspective of the Rockets trading for one of these guys, but even if it doesn't directly benefit the Rockets, then the indirect benefit is potentially there as well. If one of these 5 Western Conference teams ahead of you in the standings ends up taking a step back because of their offseason moves, even if it doesn't directly send one of those guys to Houston. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, for sure. But I think at the same time, so I think some of these, I think, 2 or 3 of those teams might, take a dive next year. But at the same time, I expect the Grizzlies to be back. I expect the Jazz to be better. So
Spurs have
not even the Spurs especially. I expect them to be better. And so I think that will balance itself out. But just to conclude the point that I was making about the moves that we would eventually make for some of these players, you're likely not going to, I think most of the moves the Rockets will be making around the margins. If it's not a start trade, around the margins would be the minimum deal type guys like Aaron Holiday this year, like replacing Boban with a guy that can actually play maybe would be, beneficial. And so I think even then, some of these guys on these good teams that were minimum guys this year, maybe slightly above the minimum next year. And because of that, and those teams not being able to pay them, the Rockets will still, have some opportunities to get guys that otherwise shouldn't be available due to those financial concerns. Obviously mentioned Bol last episode. I think with the Pelicans, the guy that I've liked for a long time, but he plays the same position a lot of our guys play. I've really liked Larry Nance Jr. for a long time, but at the same time, is he going to play over Tari? Probably not. Is he okay not playing at all or just playing if somebody's injured? Probably not. He's probably too good. So it's why it's hard to find direct ways for Rockets to benefit, but I think they'll obviously benefit from some of these veteran teams eventually dying off. And even if a team like the Spurs or the Jazz makes a little bit of a jump, I think they'll make a jump to where the Rockets are this year, and the Rockets should by then be a step above. And so they'll be running into the same problems Rockets have had this year as far as just struggling to win close games and all of the immaturities that come with a young team trying to make that leap. So I think overall the Rockets definitely benefit, even if not directly through those minimum deals that might trickle through those teams falling off for sure.
Let me ask you about one specific scenario that would involve a star level player that I've thought more about since Jackson Gatlin was the first person I saw suggest this. And initially, my response was no way for a few reasons. And then I started thinking about it. And I'm guessing you know where I'm going with this. But Jackson put on his Twitter profile last weekend a proposal of Dillon Brooks and some combination of Jock Landale, Jae'Sean Tate, and Jeff Green, your expiring contracts, and the 2024 first for Paul George. And Paul George has a player option for next season at $48 million. It'd be the last year of his contract. And we have seen a precedent of this in the last few years in the NBA. Obviously, James Harden opted in last summer in Philadelphia to eventually force his way to the Clippers. We know in 2017, Chris Paul opted into the final year of his contract with then the Clippers to force his way to the Rockets. The idea is that if you can become a free agent, which Paul George can, all you need is one team willing to give you a sizable offer in free agency. And then you can say, hey, rather than lose me for no compensation, well, I'm willing to opt in for the final year of my existing deal, and you can trade me to a preferred destination. And my initial thought was, okay, that's low. If the only assets you're giving up are Dillon Brooks and a top 10 pick in the 2024 draft, it's not supposed to be that good. Is that enough? But then I started thinking about it. Paul George is 34 years old, and he would be making nearly $50 million next year. I don't know that his asset value is that high around the league. And the Clippers going into a new arena with Kawhi Leonard still in his prime under contract, an expensive team. They probably have a wink-wink deal with James Harden. So it's not like they're going to want to take a step back and go the cap room route or rebuild. If they can get two or three decent players from the Rockets in the form of Dillon Brooks and some of the expirings, not going to say that it makes them better than with Paul George, but it can at least keep them competitive, which is what I think they want to do the next couple of years. Really, they don't have much of a choice. It's not like they would just prefer Paul George to leave so that they can then reap the benefits of, cap space or cash savings. We know Steve Ballmer is willing to spend. And from the Rockets' perspective, look, if all you're giving up from a true asset perspective is Dillon Brooks and a top 10 pick in the 2024 draft that isn't supposed to be that great and doesn't have a clear path to minutes anyway, I don't know how you wouldn't consider it. Paul George, even at 34 years old, he's a much better shooter and scorer than Dillon is. He's not the defender, but you have multiple guys internally in Tari Eason and Amin Thompson that are ready and willing to step into bigger wing defense roles. It's not as if Paul George is especially ball dominant to where he would inhibit the development of your young core. He's someone that plays off ball a decent bit, 40% shooting on threes at high volume. That's also the kind of thing that ages very, very gracefully. So I don't think Paul George is someone who would decline in a very rapid way. And I think we know he has a good relationship, by the way, with Jalen Green and Alperen Şengün. We've seen the podcast. But beyond that, I also think his shooting, his spacing can play well around those guys. And I really don't think the Clippers have a ton of leverage here because I don't see a 34-year-old Paul George on a 1-year, $48 million deal having that much leverage. I think, the people that were opposed to Jackson's idea on Twitter, it felt like they broke into one of two camps. It was, why do we want a guy who's 34 years old? Hell no. And I just think in a normal sense, if we're talking about trading for like a star player in his mid-30s to where you're dipping into your young core, I agree, you shouldn't. That's too much. But if you're talking about just giving up Dillon Brooks and maybe one first-round pick from a bad draft, that's really not eating into your long-term formula at all. So from that perspective, it's different than the names we're used to talking about that are in their mid-30s. And then stylistically, I think the fit is there. This is not like when the Rockets flirted with going after James Harden last summer, but ultimately thought that his ball-dominant style would be difficult to mesh with some of their young pieces. No, this is not like that. Paul George is capable of playing off-ball. And then in the value, some of the people that told Jackson he was crazy basically were doing it because the reaction was, look, the Clippers would just call his bluff. There's no way the Rockets would get him for that cheap. I'm honestly not sure if that's the case because, again, at his age and salary figure, I'm not sure that any team would clearly give way more asset value and have the matching salaries. You have to send out about $40 million to make the math work on such a deal to where it can all come together. So I'm not saying for sure it's going to happen. Far from it. I actually haven't heard it at all from the perspective of the Rockets. I'm just saying that when I step back and I connect the dots, I can see a case for it. Now, obviously, the first domino that would have to fall, do the Clippers go out sad as we're recording this? They're one game from being eliminated. And even if they do somehow survive Dallas, it's hard to see them getting past OKC with Kawhi Leonard suddenly in flux with his knee. And it sounds like he's not going to return at least in the next round or two. And that's if they advance, which at this point, I highly doubt they do. And if the Clippers go out sad, what does Paul George want to do? Does he want to stay in LA? Is he open to going elsewhere? If he is open to going elsewhere, would Houston be high on his priority list? There's a lot of questions. And that's before we even get into, are the Rockets interested? But I'm just saying I could see a world where it makes sense. And if the asset cost is low enough, there's no reason to have sticker shock at the $48 million because, again, is anybody really all that excited about spending over $40 million on Dillon Brooks, Jock Landale, and Jeff Green? Because that's what you're currently slated to do next season. So when you compare Paul George at $48 million to like $41 million between those three guys, I don't think it's all that abhorrent. And as far as the questions of, well, do you keep him long term and do you give him another contract? You can worry about that another day as far as what the relevant second contract would be and how that fits with extensions for your young core and so on and so forth. Because in reality, if all you're giving up is Dillon in 2024 first, you wouldn't necessarily be giving up any asset of significance to your longer term formula. So even if you couldn't come to terms, it wouldn't be a huge loss in the grand scheme. So to wrap up, because I know you've got a lot of thoughts on this, Paulo, I'm not saying you should go after Paul George at all cost. Absolutely not. All I'm saying is if the asset cost is low enough, then from a basketball perspective, I think there's something there to where he could make you better in the short term. And if the long term, i.e. the contract after this one, doesn't work out for one reason or another, then if the deal Jackson proposed is anywhere close to what you could actually get him at, that I don't think we'd look back in a year or two and say, wow, if only we kept the 2024 first, Dalton Connect and Dillon Brooks. I don't think those are franchise crippling losses in the grand scheme for the upside of a guy who still, averages 20 something points per game on 40% shooting from three and is just one of the best tough shot makers in the league. So not saying for sure I would do it, but that's just a name that over the past week I've started thinking more and more about, not just from a basketball perspective, but also just from an asset perspective and saying, hey, this might be a distressed asset that a team like the Rockets could get on the cheap if he wants to go to Houston and if indeed he does want to leave LA. Paulo, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you'll be surprised by what I think about it. So Paul George is actually one of my favorite players. Not
okay.
I know he struggles a lot in the playoffs, but just as
Not game 4, but I know your point. Yeah.
yeah, just as like an archetype or the type of player he is, to me, is almost the ideal NBA player. He's 6'9", he's like, what, 6'8", 6'9", I think. Let
Yeah.
me just check real quick. 6'8". He's a 6'8" shooting guard that actually plays like a shooting guard that can guard multiple positions, probably not at this point like he used to. And for the merits of him right now, he actually played 74 games this season. And from a basketball perspective, he gives you a lot of things that the Rockets currently need. He gives you a closer on the perimeter, like that can just get his own shot, which we don't really have. Kalen tries to, but whenever he's forced to do it, like in a pinch, right, he can do it. He still has a lot of circumstances that have to go right for him to be able to generate his own shot consistently, especially when compared to with a guy like Paul George. We do have Şengün, but there's matchups where you're going to need someone on the perimeter to get it done. And Paul George could definitely do that. So,
By the way,
then,
one last attempt at framing I want to get in. So if conceivably it was Jackson's deal, it would basically be like Fred VanVleet and Paul George were your signings from last summer. And I don't think anyone would be upset about that, instead of Fred, Dylan, Jock, and Jeff. Now, I know you'd be throwing in, the number 9 or number 10 pick this year. But for the most part, just think back to last summer. I don't think anyone would have said, wow, the Rockets really whiffed if they ended up with Fred and Paul George on 2-year deals, which would basically be what the end result is if you were to do this deal that Jackson threw out.
yeah, it really depends on how high you are on this draft class, right? On how much are you willing to buy into some of the guys that may be available at whatever this pick is. Let's assume it's 10. And if you think that you can, reliably put them on a path to success without necessarily giving them NBA minutes in year 1, because the Rockets don't have any minutes to give them. Are you going to get a guy that's going to do well in the G League, that eventually, in a year or two, when the Rockets condense rotation a little bit, is able to then break out? How often do these types of stories really work out? It's a pretty tough spot. That being said, then you've got to wonder about other things, right? Actually, when you first started mentioning a deal for a guy for the star on Twitter from Jackson, I was actually expecting you to go with Devin Booker, but I think Paul George is just as interesting of a case.
To me, Booker's a little pie in the sky. I mean, of course you'd kick the tires, but I'll believe he's on the market when I see it.
Yeah. So he's 34, right? But then the next thing you got to worry about is how are you willing to extend them? Are you paying this
Right.
first round pick are you willing to let him go or make him just a rental if you can't get to an agreement on an extension? Would he even be willing to come here if you are not in agreement on an extension? And eventually, who would be more pressured to give him potentially another max extension for 4 more years, taking him into age 38? It's not unheard of. Chris Paul got it when he was, I think, with the Suns still.
By the way, I was actually going to make a Chris Paul comp, because for all the criticism of the Suns and some of the aggressive moves they've made, I agree that Kevin Durant and Bradley Beal, they might have overcooked those a little bit in terms of surrendering every young player and draft asset in the organization to get what they thought was a super team. Obviously, it's not in reality. But I will say that the Suns in late 2020, when they were, just outside the play-in field or playoff field in the West, about 500, close to where the Rockets are now, when they made that trade for Chris Paul, who at the time was like a top 25 to 40 player in the league in terms of his perception, I think that's pretty much where Paul George is now. That took the Suns from, again, about where the Rockets are now, a young team on the rise, about 500, to a team that a year later was up 2-0 in the NBA Finals, and at the time had like an 80% plus probability of winning the title. Obviously, they couldn't close the deal. That sucks, but the point is there's value in the opportunity. I don't think anyone would say that the Chris Paul trade was a bad one for the Suns, given the window that immediately opened up and the fact they were the best team in the West the next couple of years. Not saying that's a direct apples to apples. Obviously, the playing styles of Chris Paul and Paul George are very different. Just saying in terms of an archetype for a team where the Rockets are now, bringing in a veteran star in his low to mid 30s that can sort of play off the skill sets of, or accentuate the skill sets of the young guys in place. I think the original Chris Paul deal for Phoenix might be a little bit of a template here, even if Paul George is stylistically a different type of player.
I don't even think stylistically they're that much different of a player. As
Well, I
far
just
as,
mean in terms of
they're
point
both.
guard, but yeah,
Yeah, I know what you mean, but they're both not really that ball dominant. They can both play within a system.
true.
They are, they're both good defenders. They're both, what I'm going to say is they're both plug and play, basically.
Right.
And the same thing with the Rockets and the Suns. They both feel a need for their teams without, throttling the development of young guys. Now, that leads me to say that I think if the Rockets were to make a trade like this, it would more than likely mean that Jalen Green goes to the bench. Just being honest, from a skill set perspective on the
I wasn't
floor, I
thinking that.
think
You want to start a defender?
I think you'd probably, especially with how good the Rockets are on the wings, I think you'd end up with Fred VanVleet, Paul George, Tyrese, and Jabari Smith in Auburn Shingle. So, and then you'd have, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. As much as I love Jalen, a man Jalen Cam Whitmore off the bench is also pretty enticing. So, I don't think that'd be an issue necessarily. But just to continue to advocate towards it or towards and against it, to me the biggest issue would be: are you willing to give him that extension? I'm not too clear on what the rules are nowadays about the over 36 contracts, how much of it can be guaranteed. Because if the league forces the last 2 years to not be guaranteed, so the years that take him over 36 to not be guaranteed, then that could be interesting. I'm just not sure how that rule works, especially with the new CBA.
We'll come
But
back to this in a future pod, but just in an abstract sense today.
yeah, I would, I would actually advocate for a move like that just because it fits so cleanly on what the Rockets need.
I think it does too.
Because I'm not, I don't think anybody is too high on this draft, especially at 10. But the other obstacle that I see is, why wouldn't the Warriors just play more than us? It just seems too obvious for them, right? You pair Steph Curry with Draymond with Paul George. Paul George can run a lot of the same movement shooting things that Klay Thompson does. He can defend better. He's just a overall much better player. And
Yeah.
they'd probably be more willing to commit long term to Paul George, just because once they're done with this current situation of the team, this could be their last hurrah. Once they're done with this situation of the team, they're going to tank anyway, so they don't care about the financial aspect of it, as opposed to the Rockets, who, if this doesn't work out, there's still the expectation that the team can retool, and this isn't a full-on commitment towards winning a title. This is a step along the way. So making a big financial decision like it would be to extend Paul George could have impact in the future. And so, while I do like it as a concept, and and I like it for Paul George in specific, if you mirror it and make it KD, for me it just doesn't make sense anymore. I do, I don't know. It's just, I'd really like to watch, and the fan in me would really like to watch Paul George play as a Rocket. And hopefully, if he stayed healthy,
Yeah.
I think we'd be fighting for the fourth or the fifth
Yeah.
seed, and potentially have a chance at winning a playoff series as well.
Yeah. And we can come back to the trade mechanisms as it pertains to the salary cap if we get into the next few weeks, if this is actually a possibility. I want to emphasize again that we're just talking in a very abstract, hypothetical sense here based on Jackson's tweet, which I thought too many Rockets fans were against. I think on a conceptual level, it actually does check a lot of boxes. One thing I'm curious about, I agree with you that the Warriors would seem to be a fit, and Paul George has shown substantially less signs of a decline than Klay Thompson, so they could be willing to invest more. Keep in mind, the Warriors and Clippers have the two biggest payrolls in the league, so there are some restrictions coming into play in terms of what trades they can make, what they can take in, and what they can give in some of these deals. So I need to do more homework on that, just as you do with the over 36. That can be our assignment for the next pod, and we can come back and talk about it if it looks like this is at all a possibility. But for now, I just wanted to broach the subject, and I guess step one, if the Rockets are interested in going down this path, would be for Jalen and/or Alper and Şengün, guys who appear to have a very good relationship with Paul George, to perhaps put out some feelers behind the scenes in much the same way that 7 years ago, we know that late in that season, James Harden put out some feelers to Chris Paul, and they determined that there was some mutual interest, and eventually deal got to the finish line. I think if you're interested in that, step one would be, hey, just have one of your players, because the NBA does not crack down on player-to-player tampering at all. That's been proven time and time again. Just have them feel out the situation, see if something's there, and if perhaps he's open to hearing your pitch and maybe trying to leverage his way here, then we can see where it takes us at a latter date. Another point related to that I wanted to get in, not just to Paul George, but I think anyone conceivably on the market that the Rockets could conceivably go after via trade or free agency this summer. I've seen a lot of folks respond with some variation of, well, why would a 34-year-old want to go to the Rockets when he could go to a more win now destination? I actually think what we're seeing in the playoffs this year could benefit the Rockets in a narrative sense, in that a lot of the top teams in the West specifically, you look at the Thunder and the Timberwolves, who each swept their first round series. By record, they were where the Rockets are now a year or two ago. Oklahoma City last year was 40-42. Now, I know they didn't have Chet Holmgren, but at the end of the day, I mean, Chet is just a rookie. It's not like you added a full-on max player. So I think when you look at teams like the Thunder and Timberwolves jumping levels in the Western Conference hierarchy relatively quickly, to me, it would seem to offer a little bit of hope that for a team like the Rockets that's now at 500, it might come together a little more quickly than I think fans around the league are accustomed to seeing in this era that's been defined by, established superstars. Because I think a theme of these playoffs, I mean, we're seeing teams with established superstars. No, it doesn't matter that the Lakers have LeBron and AD or that the Suns have Booker and KD. They're losing to these teams that are, younger, developing talent and systems from within. And so that might make the Rockets a little more appealing, because you can point to other teams now at the top of the West and say, hey, they a year or two ago are where the Rockets are right now. And I mentioned the Suns and Chris Paul from a few years ago. That's another example. I looked it up. Suns were actually below 500 that year. They finished up with 8 straight wins in the bubble. And then in 1 year after they had Chris, and, he plays to the development of their young core as well. That's why it was such a good fit. Then the Suns go from below 500 to best team in the West and up 2-0 in the NBA Finals. So there actually is a lot of precedent this decade for teams taking a pretty quick jump. So because of that, when you see teams like the Thunder and Timberwolves making these relatively quick jumps up the standings, and then those regular season jumps actually translating to the playoffs, both have advanced to the second round with relative ease, then to me that benefits the Rockets from a narrative perspective, because it makes it all the easier for Ime Udoka, Rafael Stone, whoever's making the pitch, to say, hey, you join us and we can get this thing to 50 plus wins in a hurry if it all comes together the way we expect it to. Do you see that sort of narrative benefit?
I do. I'm not sure how much it impacts, how players are seeing the NBA nowadays, but I think there's a lot of examples. I think the Magic are a good example of this. I think the Cavs a couple of years ago are a good example of this. I think, obviously the Thunder and the Wolves this year. I think the Grizzlies a couple of years back. There's just a lot of examples of teams just making that jump. And I think it comes from, the old core of superstars is aging out, and even some of them that aren't from the old core, we're seeing more and more as players age or these older superstars running into injury issues. I mean, KD is not this year, but obviously has run into injury issues in the past. The Brooklyn teams fell apart because of injuries. James Harden's obviously reached the postseason injured 2 or 3 times in the last 4 years. Joel Embiid hasn't been healthy or fully healthy for a postseason in God knows how long. Obviously, Giannis and Lillard are currently injured for the Bucks. Everywhere you look, I think isn't Jimmy Butler also injured right now, or am I confusing things?
And the Heat are eliminated, but yeah, he did not play against the Celtics. Yeah,
exactly. So we're seeing more and more that not only is the old crop of superstars falling off, the ones that do stay around, or the ones that are aging into it, are getting injured a lot sooner, which means it's the youth or the availability that comes with youth is actually a lot more valuable. And you see guys like Shea being able to play. You see guys like Devin Booker, even though he's not doing well, being able to play. You see, Luka being able to play. And then besides that, I think the league's less top heavy now. I do think that personally that the Nuggets and the Celtics are a clear cut above everybody else. But it's not Warriors and even the Rockets team of the 65-win team we're just better than everybody else. and there is no LeBron James in the East gatekeeping everybody as well. So it's a lot easier for a team to make that jump. And we see teams, even after they make that jump, fluctuate up and down a lot more. And so there's no true dynasties. And so I do think that, at least if I were a player in this league looking for a team to join, I would consider it a younger team than what's typically a contending team, because we see every single year at this point for the last 3 or 4 years that teams consistently make that jump. And you just gotta catch, the right boat, because I think more than ever, not the championship is random, but the team, because I think the Nuggets have obviously deserved it. I think the Celtics will eventually win one, and they will deserve it. But I think getting to the conference finals has been as varied as it could have been. So as far as how it impacts the Rockets, I definitely see. I don't know if the Rockets would be the team, or amongst the teams that could make that jump, I don't know if the Rockets would be the one with the best reputation. But at the same time, you don't need to have the best reputation. You need to have the best combination of reputation and assets, and an ability or a roster construction that fits whatever specific player becomes available. So I definitely think that more than ever, joining a young team and wanting to contend can be the same thing.
And I also think that these playoffs are showing that roster fit and chemistry are even more important. And that could be to the benefit of the Rockets, who have been somewhat methodical in developing this core six. And that appears to be the plan moving forward, in that the teams that stack stars, Phoenix, the Clippers, even Dallas, which it looks like they're going to escape the first round, but even if they do, I know you're not particularly high about what they can do with the Luka and Kyrie foundation as far as making a super deep run. It seems like the real talented teams, the top of the West, the true contenders, like the Nuggets, the Thunder, the Timberwolves, as we keep saying, are teams that develop from within, prioritize roster fit, cohesion, chemistry. And so even if the Rockets don't make a splash trade this summer, even if they largely stay the course, or perhaps, they can make a trade like Paul George that I don't think is transformative to the model. If you do something like that, it would be getting a marquee veteran that you think would play well off of the guys you have in place. And it would be the idea to still prioritize developing that core six. So to me, we've talked about throughout this pod the idea of making a splash transaction and how opportunities could arise based on these expensive teams going out sad. But I also think an important lesson to be taken from these playoffs is that even if that doesn't materialize, even if the Rockets do a very similar roster to the one they have right now going into the offseason, then the fact that these teams that aggressively stacked big names are underperforming, and the teams that have prioritized roster fit, chemistry, and have more gradually built over the years, the fact that they seem to be having the most success, to me, beyond any transaction angle, that could also be to the Rockets' benefit. It might not be next season. It might take, a couple more years. But in the bigger picture of this rebuild, in that construct, I think there's some lessons that are encouraging to the Rockets too, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think if you're going to build a super team nowadays, because of how volatile it is with injuries, I don't think the Suns version of it, for example, or even the Clippers version of it, to a lesser extent, is what works. I think the basis needs to be defense and availability. And if you have established a really good defense, then you can rely on those superstars to carry you on offense in the playoffs. So if the Suns were, the stars were less offensive driven, if it weren't Bradley Beal, even if it were just KD and Devin Booker, but then instead of paying $50 million for Bradley Beal, they had 2 or 3 role players that would, elevate the defensive level. Then you could rely on Devin Booker and Kevin Durant to, push you through these series. I think a great example of it, even though they're not exactly superstar driven right now, of this would be the Timberwolves. Even without Karl Anthony Towns, they have an insane defense, and then they can just rely on Anthony Edwards to carry them through and not have to score 130 points to beat teams or to win a series. And so it's, high volatility since beforehand you were trying to beat a super team yourself, and players just the current, usually superstars we associate with older players because those are the established ones. Since
Right.
this crop of superstars is aging and availability is so much bigger of an issue, you shouldn't necessarily be swinging for ceiling as much as you used to before when the Rockets were trying to contend back then. I think now you need to swing for consistency, and consistency comes primarily from defense, and then you hope that you get the one guy or the two guys that can carry the load offensively, which is, connecting back to the Rockets, why I like Ime Udoka and the culture that he's building so much, because
Same.
now all you need is one of these guys to emerge as a superstar offensively, and Operations is obviously already doing that, to once you get to the playoffs, be able to have as good of a chance as the other young teams. I think the Thunder, for example, they're exactly this. They're good young, even though they are one of the best shooting teams in the league. They don't necessarily have any offensive superstars besides Shea. When it comes down to winning time, Shea gets the ball every single time. Jalen Williams gets some opportunities, but for the most part, Shea is the guy that can make every single shot down the stretch of games. Besides him, you don't really point to that team and see any stars. I think the Nuggets are obviously an anomaly because they're just the most well-coordinated team offensively I have ever seen. But then you look at the Celtics, for example. The Celtics are obviously a really, really good defensive team. And so far, these playoffs, it has not been Jason Tatum that has shown through that. It has actually been Derek White that's been carrying them scoring-wise. But the same thing applies. You have a couple of guys that can, take that defense and elevate the offense enough that you are beating these teams while holding opponents to low scoring. You look at the Knicks, that what are the Knicks? They're probably going to beat the Sixers, or they're at least up a game. What are they? They are a Tom Thibodeau team who is going to be built on defense, and they have they used to have two guys with Julius Randle, but now they have one guy, and all of the eggs are in that basket. And if Jalen Brunson can take them there, he can take them there. But his job is made so much easier by the fact that they don't need to score 120 points to win a game, because the
Right.
defense is going to hold the other team. And I think as much as people want to crap on the state of defense in the league, I think these playoffs have actually proven time and time again that what's winning right now are good defenses with stellar offensive players to carry them, with the exception obviously being the Nuggets, where they're just going to mow everybody down because they're just that good.
So I think you covered it well from a team perspective in terms of potential comps or analogs for the Rockets from the current playoff feel and what some of the lessons or implications could be for Houston moving forward. I also want to look briefly at it from an individual player perspective, because you mentioned a team that I've enjoyed watching a lot, which is the Knicks. And when I see Josh Hart and the impact that he makes on a game through the relentless motor, attacking the glass from the wing, putting his body constantly in harm's way, I can't help but think about what it will be like having Tari Eason on that stage where every possession is magnified and your ability to get a 50-50 ball means even more. I mean, certainly during the regular season, you can feast on teams that, are in a rough patch of their schedule. But I think in the playoffs, when everybody goes to an extra level, to see what that translates to for a guy like Josh Hart, who you think is at 100% during the season, but boy, in the playoffs, you see what his 110% is, and it's off the charts, making an impact, even if he's not a dynamic scorer. That gives me so much hope for a guy like Tari Eason. And it's entirely possible, I don't want to sell Tari short, that Tari develops offensively into a better player than what Josh Hart currently is. But I'm just saying in terms of a template, even if Tari doesn't develop as a top shelf scorer or playmaker, and Ime even compared him earlier this year to a young Kawhi Leonard, and perhaps the Rockets get really lucky and that's the trajectory he takes on. But even if he just sort of stays with the path he's been on for his first 2 years, seeing what a guy like Josh Hart can do in a playoff setting and the impact that has, not just the plays that he makes and the 50-50 balls that he gets to, but just on the competitive spirit and what that does for the surrounding players, what that does for the energy in the arena. There's just so many benefits that you especially see in the playoffs from a guy like that. And so Josh Hart is a guy that's made me even more excited about what Tari Eason can do when the stakes are magnified and the games are really meaningful for the Rockets. Is there anybody like that for you, Paulo, that when you watch them, you get excited about when you think about what one of the current young guys on the Rockets might eventually turn into?
Yeah, and this is not going to be a popular pick because I think this is underselling the guy that I'm going to be talking about. But
That's
it
okay,
makes me
because
feel,
I think, Josh Hart might be underselling Tari Eason too. So, but I
I
think you
think
get
so
where I'm
too.
going, so you can do the same thing.
It really comforts me to see how Aaron Gordon's able to thrive in Denver. And
Oh,
my
that's a
comp's
good one.
it's actually going to be Amen Thompson.
Hmm.
I think, the way he moves and the way he picks his spots to be around the court while not being, that great of a shooter and, contributing obviously with offensive rebounds. And Aaron Gordon, in Orlando, they tried to make him an offensive option and a passer, which made a lot of people, swing the other way and say, oh, this guy was said to be, or have the potential to be this insane passer. But I actually think he's a good passer for the role that he's playing now. Just like Amen is a really good passer if he were to be shrunk down to a role like that. And it just makes me feel more comfortable with the fact that Amen may never be able to be, a good enough shooter to be, a point guard of sorts. But I think with how smart he is, with how good he is defensively, with how good he is at rebounding, with how good he is at picking his spots on the floor, and how good he is at making those connective passes, the Nuggets are the best team in the league for me. I think they're better than the Celtics, and it comforts me that even with a star center as the star, with a star center who is obviously an inside presence for the most part, he's still able to thrive. As far as a potential connection between Şengün and Amen Thompson might go, I think Amen can do a lot of the same things that Aaron Gordon is doing. And obviously, not saying that's all Amen is going to be, but at the very least, I think he can be that for sure.
All right, the last item on my agenda for today, we can go through this quickly. I wrote an article on Rockets Wire that went out Thursday morning, May 2nd, looking at the Rockets' internal free agents or potential free agents, because some of these guys have team options. And we can go through this quickly because, spoiler alert, these are not sexy names. The Rockets have a 9-man rotation going into next year, assuming health, that are all under contract. Fred VanVleet, Jalen Green, Dylan Brooks, Jabari Smith Jr., Alperen Şengün, your starters for most of the season. Then on the bench, you've got Amen Thompson, Cam Whitmore, Tari Eason, and Steven Adams. That's your 9-man rotation, and they're all under contract already. So we can talk hypotheticals about guys the Rockets might trade for, or perhaps they use their non-taxpayer mid-level exception to sign somebody in free agency, although that'd be sort of a delicate dance because I don't see that many minutes that you can guarantee. Now, maybe some minutes open up because of injuries. Those always happen. But the point is, a lot of guys that have options want to be guaranteed minutes as opposed to wait for something speculative to develop where maybe they get minutes later on. So the Rockets have some guys that they could conceivably fill these roles from internally. And so I'm going to run through the names. Jock Landale, Jae'Sean Tate, Jeff Green all have team options that the Rockets can decide on. Reggie Bullock Jr., Boban, Aaron Holiday, unrestricted free agents. And Boban is the only one that the Rockets have bird rights on. And then you have your 3 two-way guys, Nate Hinton, Jermaine Samuels Jr., and Nate Williams. Those are all year to year. So I'm going to break them down in those tiers. I think amongst the unrestricted free agents that don't have team options, I don't expect them to bring back Bullock or Boban. I just think while Bullock was a useful shooter, the defense in his 30s is clearly on the decline. And my guess is without a clear path to minutes, the Rockets might go for a younger shooter in that spot. And then with Boban, I know the vibes are important, but it's a little less important if you have Steven Adams on the roster and playing. Would they really commit a 4th roster spot to a center-only player? Because in this hypothetical, and I'm going to get to it, the Rockets do end up picking up the option on Jock Landale. So that would give you Alperen Şengün, Steven Adams, and Jock Landale at center. Amongst the team option guys, I think Jock Landale let me go back to unrestricted real quick. So Bullock and Boban, unlikely. I think the Rockets move on. Aaron Holiday, I put as 50-50 in my analysis. I think the Rockets would love to keep Holiday. I think he was valuable in that role. He was the perfect vet who was ready to step into bigger minutes if there was an injury, like when Amen Thompson hurt his ankle in the fourth game of the season, and then felt like as soon as the men got back up to speed, well, that's when Tari Eason wasn't out there, so there was still a way for Aaron to get minutes most of the year. But if he didn't have such high expectations that he would cause trouble in the locker room. He was a good teammate. And so I think the Rockets would love to have him back. He's a good on-ball defender. He can make threes. The question is if another team around the league would offer him a more clear path to playing time or more money. I don't think for that role the Rockets want to invest very heavily, but I think they'd offer him a minimum deal or something similar to what they got him on last year. And if Aaron can't do better elsewhere, then I think there's a path for them to reunite, but it's sort of speculative. So I would say amongst the unrestricted guys, Bullock and Boban, unlikely. Aaron Holiday, 50-50. I think the Rockets would love for it to happen, but it just depends on the market and whether Aaron can get a better deal elsewhere. Amongst the team options, I think Jock Landale and Jae'Sean Tate are almost slam dunks. Now, this is all under the hypothetical that they don't trade them. I mean, it's possible that any of these guys could get used as salary filler in June before the team option. That way, they'd almost be like zero money committed to another team, but they would have the right to use them, the Rockets and the other team, as $7-8 million matching salary in trades. So it'd be like having the benefit of the matching salary, but zero financial commitment. So it is possible that these guys could be used in trades, but this exercise is under the hypothetical that there is no trade, and the Rockets just have to decide whether they bring them back. I think Landale and Tate, even if there's no guaranteed minutes, at $7 and $8 million expiring contracts, guys that are good vets, that can provide solid defense, contribute to the culture. There was a report that at this year's trade deadline, the Mavs offered 2 second-round picks. They might have been low second-round picks, but still it's some value for Tate. I think if nothing materializes this summer, you pick them up, and at their ages, they're not going to decline. If anything, they'd be neutral value because they're expiring contracts, maybe even slightly positive value, and you'd have them at the end of your bench to step in if there are any injuries. Jeff Green, I put as likely. However, I don't think it's 100% a given simply because his salary at nearly $10 million and his age at 37, there is a chance he could decline. And that's a lot of money for a guy who wouldn't initially project to be in your rotation. Now, with that said, it's not my money, so I hope Tillman Fertitta spends it. It's not as if the Rockets could then turn around and spend it elsewhere because they're going to operate as above the cap team this summer. And I think Jeff Green is a well-regarded vet around the league, so I hope they keep him around. But I have him as likely rather than very likely simply because, again, it's a lot of money for someone and it's more money than Landale and Tate, and for a guy who's also about a decade older as well. So while I think the Rockets would like to keep Jeff, and if I had to guess, I think they do, but just the financial realities of the NBA have me a little less certain on that. And then the two-way guys, I think Hinton is the most likely to stay. I mean, he was an all-defense guy in the G League. He's the youngest of the three as well at 24 years old. We saw Ime Udoka trust him a couple of times this year. He played well at Memphis that game right before the All-Star break. He actually played some minutes in place of Jalen Green. The other two, I mean, Jermaine Samuels and Nate Williams are both 25 years old. Williams had some flashes as a scorer, but honestly, scorers are sort of a dime a dozen at his age. It's not that hard to find someone that can do those things. I think they could keep them. Obviously, they were good for the Summer League team last year, but I also think that if Rafael Stone sees someone that he likes better in the draft as an undrafted free agent, as someone that comes available from another team, then perhaps he upgrades one of those spots. So I would say of the two-way guys, I think Nate Hinton is likely to stay, and Jermaine Samuels and Nate Williams maybe, but I think Rafael Stone will look around and see if he can do better with that. So bottom line for me, I ranked it in 4 tiers. Very likely Landale, Tate, and Hinton. Likely Jeff Green. 50-50 Aaron Holiday, Jermaine Samuels, and Nate Williams, although 50-50 for different reasons. I think the two-way guys, Rockets will look to upgrade if they can. Remains to be seen if that's possible. And with Aaron Holiday, I think the Rockets would love to have him back. It just depends on whether the marketplace gives Holiday a better offer and better role than what he have available here. And then unlikely, the guys I don't expect to be back would be Reggie Bullock. And unfortunately, Boban, as great of a guy as he is, someone else will have to win free chicken for the Clippers next year. So when you look at those tiers, are you in the same place that I am? Do you have any different takes as far as who you put in each tier and the likelihood of the Rockets keeping those guys?
So I would So for the most part, yes, I agree with the unlikely ones. I think Boban and Bullock are gone. I think Holiday's in the 50-50, but not because of what you said. I do agree that he'll make more than a minimum this year, but actually I think it's the Rockets who are going to decide if they want to keep him or not, because they have the ability to use part of the MLE or the biannual exception on
Yeah,
him.
that's fair too. Both sides will look around. I mean, the question from the Rockets standpoint is if someone else would as gracefully accept that role. Like a name I've seen thrown around a bit on Twitter this week is Eric Gordon of the Suns, because Gordon's someone who made near the minimum this year, and of course his play is above that. And I've seen some people saying, well, could the Rockets use the mid-level exception to bring in Eric Gordon and put him in the Aaron Holiday role? Yeah,
Yeah,
financially you could, but then he'd be probably upset with that uncertain level of playing time, and we know what it's like. Paulo, you specifically know what it's like
uh,
when Eric Gordon is a little crabby, so that's just a good example. I do think the Rockets will see if maybe they can do better, but you also have to factor in not just if the player is better basketball-wise, but if they would as gracefully accept the Aaron Holiday role as Aaron did last year.
yeah. I'm not sure. I'm not sure Eric would be a good locker room fit. It's
Right,
listen,
for
he
those
said he
reasons.
said he said
Yeah.
some stuff when he was on his way out. So yeah, but I agree with it. The two-way guys, while I agree, Hinton's probably the one with the most projectable NBA role. I'd actually like them to keep Nate Williams. Jermaine Samuels, I don't really care. The Rockets do have something that's worth mentioning since I'm just, adding a little bit on top of what you already said. With the second round picks that the Rockets have, and with the roster crunch as far as roster spots go, it's possible that some of their second round picks, if they make them, they don't get the Hinkie special, and instead they get two-way deals because of how the roster spots are currently working with the Rockets. But
We'll
then
have the number
listen,
44 pick this year from Golden State, by the way.
yeah. So if it were up to me, but then going to the likely and very likely, Jeff Green should be very likely. I hope
Okay.
Tillman isn't, I hope Tillman doesn't, it would be weird to worry about, that small of a deal while not worrying about some of the stuff that we
Fair.
did during the rebuild, because we were, for the first year of the rebuild, one of the highest paying, rebuilding teams as far
That's a
as
good point.
the payroll goes. So I would say just because from a salary filler, it makes sense. The Rockets could, if they do decide to not pick up Jeff Green's option, they just lose that salary. They don't have any other way to do it other than the MLE, which will be untradeable for most of the season, and you'll likely, that's a bigger commitment unless you don't use the entire 4 years. But I do agree, Landale should be, he's to me the biggest slam dunk of these. Not necessarily because of his level of play, even though it got better as the season went on, but because of the contract structure.
Yeah, and you have
And
two more team options after this year. So he continues to be basically a human trade exception for you for as many as 3 more years if you need it. And by the way, real quickly to your point on salary filler, the Paul George hypothetical was revealing to me in that you could get to Paul George's number, which is one of the highest paid players in the league, simply between Dylan and two of those three fillers being Jock, Tate, and Jeff. So that's what opened my mind a little bit to, hey, is there a world where they decide Jeff at his age is a little too much? I hope they don't. I don't think they will, but that's just the one scenario where I sort of was like, if they can still have enough matching salary anyway, then is Jeff worth it? But honestly, he probably is for the reasons you laid out. And also, we should point out, the double locker thing in the Rockets locker room. We've talked about that dynamic before. The two double lockers, Fred VanVleet and Jeff Green. So I think that speaks to how valued he is as a leader. So yeah, the more I think about it, we should probably move Jeff to very likely.
they may need to give one of those double lockers to Steven Adams just because of the sheer size, right?
Oh
It's
yeah,
probably it's
good
probably
point.
uncomfortable if you
Good
shove
point.
him into one of the small ones
Yeah,
between
yeah,
two other players. It's probably going to be tough, just from a ergonomic standpoint, right?
yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
I'm joking, but yeah. So I think we've hit it all. I think there may be an argument to be made about choosing between Tate and Jeff if they do need to choose one. I'm not sure I'd take Tate.
Well, and if the other argument that you could make, I mean, Jeff is a shooter in a way that Tate isn't. And if you were offered two picks for Tate at the deadline, you could potentially trade Tate in June anyway. You could pick up the option and then trade him as opposed to not pick up the option. So if it's something like that, then Tate, even if you need to or want to save a little bit of cash off the payroll, then you could get, something small asset wise for Tate. It seems like he had positive trade value at the deadline. He's still young enough to have value around the league. I do think that, he'd fit a little bit better if he was on a team where he could compartmentalize a little more than he can with the current Rockets setup. So yeah, I think I'm there with you in that if you really need it to save up some money for Jeff, then yeah, you could probably offload Tate for a little bit. Anyway, that's our overview as of now. Didn't want to spend too much time on it. And by the way, to your point on Nate Williams, I was thinking about it as you said. If you let Bullock go, maybe Nate Williams is the guy who then takes that role as your 10th, 11th man that can fill it up in a hurry if you need that, because that's ultimately what Bullock was last year. Once it became clear that Bullock was nowhere near the defender he was in his prime, I mean, he was basically just that 40% three-point shooter that you turn to if you were having an ugly game on offense and you need someone to shake it up a little bit and to space the floor. And perhaps that's a role that Nate Williams can fill if you choose to keep him. Anyway, we'll get into that more in the weeks and months ahead. Again, a lot of this, most of this episode, the trade hypotheticals, the ideas we tossed out, and now talking about the Rockets going up to, the deadlines are near the end of June for most of these guys with the team options, because of course the NBA flips to its new fiscal year on July 1st. That's when free agency starts, technically the evening of June 30th, but you get the idea. So there's still a couple of months to go until the Rockets have to make final decisions on this. This is just to give a very preliminary look at some of the things that Rafael Stone and his staff are going to be debating over the coming weeks. And then we can evaluate more thoroughly as we get closer to late June and more concrete information starts to emerge as to what the Rockets are considering, what they're likely to do, and if they have any broader roster moves that perhaps change the construct and the thinking behind some of this. Again, this exercise is strictly based on the team they have right now. We'll see if that's still the case once we get through the draft transaction window in late June. All right, we've talked enough today, so we will wrap it right there. For Paulo, Alves, I'm Ben DuBose. If you want to get a hold of us before the next episode, the best way to do it is on Twitter/X, where Paulo is on there at Paulo Alves NBA, and I'm on there at Ben DuBose. And the show is on there at The Logger Line, where if you go to the link tree in the bio, not only can you support our friends, sponsors, and partners, Carback Brewing, Sports Talk 790, USA Today's Rockets Wire, but you can also hit up our distributors, Apple, Google, Spotify. If you're not already subscribed, you can do so through those links and leave us a positive review. That way you get the benefit of episodes as soon as they come out before we can even post them to our Twitter feeds or those other websites. And we get the benefit, hopefully with your subscription and happy review, of looking good to those friends, partners, and sponsors and keeping this program going as one of the most active covering Houston Rockets basketball. All right, with the plug complete, we will break things here. For Paulo, I'm Ben. Thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode of The Logger Line.